Come on, my pussy's getting impatient.
Hello and welcome to Talking About. This week we are presenting part 1 of 4 of season 2. So I'm Paul or P-Bal. You've got to like this, you've got to subscribe to us and share it amongst the people so everyone can embrace our wisdom. I am joined as ever by...
Hello, it's James.
And hello, it's Jason.
You stop making the rude gestures now, dear viewer. He was trying to distract me from my introduction. And do you know what? As a professional, it just didn't work.
Oh, it's a shame.
And he definitely did it in one take.
Have we decided what we're sharing? Is this a new option?
Jason, I don't want to know what you're offering to share, to be honest. And I don't think this is the platform to be doing it. You're very lucky that Ed the Duck's not here this week, because I'm telling you, he got some firm opinions on this season. He wasn't reliant on yeast extract.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah. He's not managed to pinch my spot just yet. Then.
No, it might be Orville that gets it. So anyway, without further ado, we're going to be starting with Planet of Giants. But who's reading the back of a Target today?
I don't have them, so I should.
I haven't read the back of the Target on this one, but I don't also have anything that's necessarily pre-prepared, other than it's the start of the second season, and we're back on Earth, and it's kind of a 3-part story, which is a bit of a new thing for us.
It's kind of a 3-part story. It is a 3-part story.
Well, it was kind of a 3-part story because I've watched the extra recon bits on the DVD this time. That actually was originally planned to be broadcast, in fact, as a 4-part story, written as such, filmed as such, and then right at the last minute, it wasn't really liked by the suits on floor 6, so they cut the last 2 parts together to make a sort of a 3 and 4 into 3. So it is kind of a 3-part.
How many episodes were broadcast?
3.
I call it 3. So. Anyway.
Oh dear, we're off to a good start, aren't we? I mean, it's essentially Honey, I Shrunk the TARDIS, isn't it? And they actually shrunk the running time as well to match. But yeah, there's a sort of malfunction on the TARDIS, and the doors get opened in flight, and some reason that shrinks them all. And so you have the plot of them trying to become unshrunk, if you like. But then you've got this other plot where you've got this sort of espionage, industrial espionage that's going on around a, pesticide that this guy wants to be marketed, but then sort of ends up having to kill someone and is threatening the scientist. So you've got that plot going on, and then you've got the plot of the TARDIS crew trying to basically sort themselves out and get back to normal size. Ian ends up in a massive sort of matchbox and gets sort of taken away. We get the first of several large insects for this season. With an ant and a wasp and this giant cat as well. It's it's an interesting one because I can kind of see why it was cut to 3, because it's kind of something and nothing. Is you've got these 2 plots, they interweave quite nicely, but it's a really odd story, and it was held over from the last season. So there's a couple of stories that were filmed in the same block, and they put it as the opener. But I don't know whether it's like opener material, if you like. It doesn't sort of say whash, we're back with a bang. It's kind of like here's a story that wasn't good enough to be 4 parts, so we've condensed it down to 3. I don't know. I
think, Sidney Newman was very keen early doors for this to be the opening, wasn't it? Because there was this thoughts that the TARDIS could go forwards, backwards, sideways, and what if it, you know, and they decided it's probably too difficult for them to do it as the first story. So it was an idea that kept coming back, and they were determined to sort of do. And I think, were I a 6-year-old kid or 10-year-old kid, I guess, in 1964, it probably would have been quite exciting. And I think watching it now, it feels a bit like a No Hiding Place or something that's chopped in with a Doctor Who, because it's funny coming straight off the back of watching season 22, which is the last one we did, where nearly every story sort of has an adventure and Doctor Who passes by and gets involved or doesn't. This is almost the same sort of thing, isn't it? Because Doctor Who, I mean, they don't meet the people involved in the sort of the criminal endeavour with the pesticide and all that sort of stuff. So it does have that sort of feel of a sort of, you know, 60s crime show, and Doctor Who's just sort of around it. It doesn't have a traditional Doctor Who feel. But it's one of those stories that people always sort of go, I know the Giants. And I think, and he's one of the last to put on VHS and all that. I think it's always had that kind of reputation of being a bit, and I thought I wasn't going to enjoy it. And I mean, I wouldn't say I rollicked and thought this is amazing, I love this. But I admired in a lot of ways the ingenuity, and I liked the construct of it. And I did think it was quite a sweet little thing. If, as we've said, if it were in 4 parts, it really would have been an extra chunk, just too much. I think 3 parts is absolutely. I don't feel we've lost a wondrous 25 minutes of material. I think this is about the right length for it.
No, I agree, and I think like you, I think this is actually quite a chirpy little 3-parter, and I like it. It's particularly grand in the scale that it's trying to set, because, you know, when you try and make large props to try and make it look like they've been shrunk down in kind of the way they did, in today's world, that would all be done with computer-generated graphics. Back in the day, they had to almost build these, well, they did. They had to build these things in studio, in situ. And I think that makes this quite impressive just from that visual aspect of it. So, you know, the giant matchbox and the little bit of the satchel, and, you know, the giant insects and okay, you know, if you look at it closely, it doesn't stand a huge amount of scrutiny. But back in the day, I think that would have been quite impressive to see on screen. And, you know, I always think about this, you know, back in the 60s, we're still experimenting a lot with television. And this is another one of those sort of experimental things for me, is that, you know, they took something on quite a grand scale, and I think it was well realized on screen.
They did. I mean, the actual episode was filmed on 16mm, but the bits like with the cat behind me, that was 32mm. So again, there's some really nice effects in there where you've just got the sort of dead body, you've just got the head, and they're standing in front of the head. You've got the bit with the cat. You're right, some of the model work with the insects maybe isn't amazing, but there was no CGI really in back then, and it's passable. You know, it can, as you were saying, P-Bal, you know, if you were a sort of 6-year-old watching this in amongst, you know, other TV series, that this kind of mimics some of those cop shows as well. There's an element of that espionage, and you know, sort of you got I wrote down Rosemary, the phone operator from Hong Kong Phooey, but it's not. But her real name is Rosemary, so that's where I got it from, because it's Hilda, the telephone operator, who happens to live with the policeman of the village. It's just, you know, it's that kind of thing. But you're right in the fact that it was ambitious. You know, when they get to the get inside the house, and they're, you know, you've got all these test tubes, and they're walking along, and yeah, some of it, you know, doesn't look amazing by today's standards, but I think being in black and white also helps, because it looks better. But yeah, it's not one that I dislike. It's just an interesting, different style of Doctor Who story. And like you say, a bit like 22, because the Doctors, the two storylines are running at the same time, and they do intersect. Obviously, Barbara touches the grain, and then she starts to get ill with the pesticide, so they've got to try and save her. But other than that, the main characters don't necessarily interact at all, because you've got the two things that are happening at the same time. Just a little bit of, when they telephone to try and do an SOS to try and get the police to come. That's pretty much their involvement, and then they're back to the TARDIS, and let's get everybody sorted back out. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
Barbara's pesticide story is actually quite funny, isn't it? Because she does a lot of that kind of. So, were someone to come into contact with a pesticide, would it be fatal for them? Well, yes, I think it should be, Barbara. Why?
She's in the
no
background.
No reason. It's like, oh, just tell them.
She's like, throwing it up in the air, going, "What? What's wrong with it? What's wrong with it?" And then for the rest of the story, she's like, "No, I never touched it. No.
I feel tired and a bit sick. I better just have a sit down. Thank goodness I didn't touch any of that pesticide." I mean, TV's Doctor Who should have twigged, really. I think at some point she'd gone, "Do you know what, Barbara? I've got this intuition. Did you have a little bit of LC? Did you touch the poison?" But it's also sweet, like you said about Hilda. I love the fact that Hilda, the telephone, is the nosy old bag, is the one who saves the day. She works it out, doesn't she? So she does. I mean, there aren't many Doctor Who stories where it's foiled by the old bag on the telephone exchange.
And in some respects, Hilda and Bert are almost like the comic relief in this story. So they do form they sit to the outside of both the plots, but they intersect it. But they are like comic foils to a degree, and a little bit just over the top with their characterizations of that sort of country postmistress or phone operator, whatever she is, and the local policeman. They do make me laugh. They make me laugh rather than me take them quite seriously.
I mean, Forrester's like some sort of villain you would find in the Avengers or something like that, where he's, happy to kill anyone who gets in his way, and wants to market this pesticide. So there are lots of familiar bits to this story that you could take out and you would find elsewhere. But I mean, the ambition behind it certainly is there, and there's a few stories in this season, and we'll come on to talk about them. How many parts? Four parts. I mean, wow, getting the money's worth. But there are other stories that have got ambition that maybe don't necessarily reach that height of that ambition in this season. But in this one, I think it does work. But like I say, glad they cut it down. I know Ian Levine did a recreation, didn't he? Is that the one that you watched, 2012?
Yeah, so that's the one that's included on the DVD, and it's an interesting curio to watch, I would say, because it was really interesting. So they brought William Russell and Carole Ford back to reprise their roles as part of the recon, and there's a couple of other voice actors there alongside them. But it never quite manages to fit entirely back into the when they weave the footage back together again. So watching it as two separate standalone episodes, it's interesting. You can definitely see why they cut it back, but it's definitely one for the completists rather than the fans, I would say.
I mean, were I to be unkind at any point in the world, as a plot, he wants to get the thing into being manufactured, even though he knows it kills everything. It kills plants, it kills insects, it hurts me. I can't help thinking that, firstly, someone else might test this before it goes into mass production. And secondly, if it did go into mass production, would he not be in a lot of trouble for basically forcing out a very dangerous chemical that's lethal to everything? I mean, he wouldn't really be able to do a runner with the money, would he? Because they'd be like, well, this guy's, they won't be paying him in cash or bullion.
He's certainly not one of our more intelligent villains. And, although he would have got the government to have signed it off, essentially, I don't think the government would necessarily have taken responsibility for it.
Well, depending if he's related to one of them, they might have an interest in it.
I was going to say, by our current government standards, they probably sign a blank check and go, "Here you are."
Some of them might actively encourage it if it's lethal. Just saying. So I don't. It's interesting because I say I didn't dislike watching. I thought it was quite a jaunty little thing to sit through. But there's not a mass you can really say about that, and I don't know whether that's a strange thing in some ways. There's not a lot to come away from it. There's lots of little bits that's quite sort of like when they're running with the matchstick to try and strike it. I thought there were lots of lovely little bits of business with that, but there's not a huge amount. I mean, joking aside, I did read the Target novelization. It's one of Terence's afternoon jobs. It's a really brief book, and I think the audiobook only comes in at sort of like 2 hours, and it's a really short thing. So I don't know whether it needed just something else within it, or did it need, I mean, it's too late now, it's 60 years ago, but did it need maybe some of the crew to be small, some of the crew to be big, so the big could be involved in, did it need a dilemma like that? Because Barbara touching the granary seed or whatever, it's not a massive problem. And then they sort of go back to the TARDIS and they're like, look, we're back to normal. And I saw a policeman, so that's sorted as well.
And it's sort of odd because I think where they've cut the 2 episodes together for 3 and 4, some of the scenes in the televised episode 3 some of them don't quite make sense. So you're not quite sure, so when you get the bits where the cat's in the laboratory, you've all that bit's cut out, and you've got all the extra bits at the phone exchange that are cut out. And also taking the seed back into the TARDIS, and then that's the thing that tells us that they're growing back to normal size. That just wouldn't happen because it's in a different dimension, surely.
But you expected the seed to go massive. Did you?
No, I expected it to stay the size it was when they took it in there. So they always remain being a giant seed.
But they changed size when they came in and out. Did you miss the point of Planet of Giants? When they were smaller, they shrunk.
No, I know. But the TARDIS itself
had
shrunk, but that doesn't necessarily mean the inner bit has shrunk because that's in a different dimension.
It was smaller. They came out smaller.
The whole thing had shrunk, inside and out.
I know what I'm saying.
Planet of Giants is about Doctor Who and his crew. They shrank. So they were smaller. And so they took the small things back out and put them in the TARDIS. Because if they hadn't shrunk but the TARDIS was the same size, they wouldn't fit in the TARDIS because they'd just be small, wouldn't they?
I see your point.
Although I do like I like the idea that there could be this humongous cat somewhere in the TARDIS because it snuck in while they were sort of growing bigger again.
I mean, that's one of your cliffhangers right there, the cat.
Yeah, the cat.
Dudley Simpson's first outing in Doctor Who as well in this story. Carrying the incidental music for us in this one.
Was he carrying it too?
Should we have some facts?
Go on, give us a fact or 8.
There's not a lot to talk about the episode. So, depending on which source you believe, various different novelizations and sort of companion books date this as being in 1963. Which is the Terence Dicks novelization, 1964, which is a unit chronology, that's the word, or 1969, which is referenced by John Peel in his novel. So who knows? But it's the first time back on contemporary Earth since Unearthly Child. But they're tiny, so they don't leave the TARDIS.
Jason, they're tiny. They're shrunk.
Teeny.
He's giving such a frosty old look, dear viewer. If only you had multivision.
We don't allow that.
I was going to say, for once he wasn't taking the camera back, but that was all of 2 seconds, and then he was back on it. Before the introduction of the cloister bell, which would still be for many, many years, we had the emergency klaxon.
Oh, I know. Oh my Lord, that is quite the shock.
There's a lot. What I noticed about this, particularly the first and second seasons, there's a lot of bits of the TARDIS that you never see again. It's just like for one episode, and then the whole wall disappears, or a bit of instrumentation is never seen again. Yeah, and it was inspired by Rachel Carson's 1962 book Silent Spring. Douglas Camfield was credited as directing the last episode, although technically he did episode 4, but when they combined the two, they gave him the nod for directing, even though he didn't do 3. But there we go.
Oh, well, that was a cheeky little thing, because what they did was, for speed, they kept the credits, the original credits that they had for episode 4, and that's why that happened. They didn't remake them.
So, yeah.
Right. So are we ready for some scores for Doctor Who and the Planet of Giants? Don't mix it with the ITC series, the American series, Land of Giants.
Land of the Giants.
Which is a lot more expensive, and it's in colour because it's American.
I remember watching that as a kid.
Repeats, though. Specify repeats, because they'll think you're as old as Jason.
Yeah.
I do. Just one more thing on this one. I do think it's quite interesting, though, because this was held over, and this and the next story were held over from the first recording block, essentially. So they did 52 episodes in essentially season 1, and it is an interesting. I think it's an interesting decision. I go back to what you said earlier, James. It's an interesting decision that they took time to take the break from, the Reign of Terror into the Planet of Giants. Well, why not, like I said, run Planet of the Giants and then launch off with the Daleks as the start of the season, which for me feels like a more natural start to it. So it is odd positioning. I agree.
But that's a technicality, though, in that they only cut it at the end of Reign of Terror to get the production break, to make the gap between transmission and less of a thing. But of course, then this story means that we get Mission to the Unknown later on, because they're an episode short, aren't they? So it takes a year or so, but they claw it back.
Yeah, they do. They actually tried to stretch Dalek Invasion of Earth out, I understand, by another episode, but that was never going to wear it anyway. But we'll talk about that next. But it's an interesting decision. But that's television of the time for you.
But I would still argue, though, that it isn't Doctor Who shrinks to a 1-inch tall a good concept as a lead line in your Radio Times. Doctor Who's back this week, and they've all shrunk. And I don't know. Well, the reality of it, it's a bit like a network DVD where you read the premise and you're like, that sounds amazing, and it arrives, you think, crikey, okay, the premise sounds great, but the reality is awful. I don't know whether that's what you have with like Planet of Giants, is that you go, our Doctor Who's back and he's shrunk, and it's an exciting adventure, and miniature world, and will he ever be back to the same size? I mean, the reality of that isn't quite as jeopardy laden as it could be. But I don't know whether the notion of it leading with what would have been possibly the first story, ever. And obviously, I mean, the promo all went in the Daleks. Their kids at home were like, it's lovely seeing 1-inch Doctor Who, but where are the Daleks? And get the Radio Times cover out, get the trailers on the TV. That's when it sort of goes big. But I don't think it's an awful sort of launch.
I mean, I have to say, you're right. There's 52 stories. I mean, it was like a whole year of filming. There was quite a consistent amount. I know they had weeks off during some of the filming, some of the stories. But if you think, I know obviously we've been affected by COVID, but if you think by today's production, they were pretty much filming every single day. To get these episodes out, and there is a 6-week there was a 6-week holiday after this block before they came back. But it must have been quite an intense period of filming. Particularly, I mean, they're also about to benefit from moving to a slightly bigger studio, but it was very, the original studio was tiny, and they were, they recorded 52 episodes, so quite a slog.
Well, yeah, because they would rehearse. They'd start rehearsing literally on the Monday. They'd run all the way through till the end of the week. They'd film. They'd essentially put the episode in the can and have a day off, and then they'd be back to it, learning the lines for the next week. So it really was a real a turnstile of production, really, for them.
They got good money for it. Yeah. Okay, so scores on the doors for Doctor Who and the Planet of Giants.
I'll go first. I never really thought of Planet of the Giants as a bad story. It's not one that had particularly struck me as being unwatchable, and we've had a few of those recently in other seasons. But I watched it. I quite enjoyed it. I thought, like I say, the ambition for that time. If I was a kid watching it, and I saw them shrunk, and I saw the giant cat and things like that, and there is that sort of, when Forrester kills the guy, you just see his body lying on the ground with the little TARDIS crew next to it. There are some stark images in this. Is it a classic? No, but I did give it a 6.
6 points. How much is Jason giving it?
Okay, so I'm about to reveal that right now. So a lot of what James has just said, it rings quite true. It's a very ambitious story in its scale. And I think the fact that if you imagine that quite a lot of that was realized in a small pokey studio at Lime Grove, then I think they weren't doing too bad. Shout out for Ray Mancusic, because obviously it's his design work. So it's him that's realized a lot of the sort of sets in this story. And I think it's the sets that help to give the story something. The Avengers-esque storyline that's going alongside it could have been any story. I'm not attached to that particularly. I think the main peril here is the regulars all shrunk down to an inch in size, trying to somehow all group back together again and get themselves back to full size. It's a reasonable watch. Little bit pedestrian in its script, but I think that everybody involved put a lot of effort into it to try and turn it around. It's not a classic, but neither is it a clunker, and I opted for a 6.
Yeah, I admire the ambition, I admire all that, and I think it's great. But there is something of just something that's missing from it. There's just a little connection somehow. So I don't think it's awful, and I don't think it's amazing. So I'm literally saying it's average. So I gave it a 5. Yeah. So it's not awful. I've given worse. I've given worse the better. No. So that brings Planet of the Giants out on 17 points, which would make it better than anything in season 18. I'm joking.
It probably did, actually.
So we move on to the second part of season 2, which is the last story of the first production block, and that is Dalek Invasion of Earth. Do you want to say anything, James, at this point?
Oh, I don't mind taking the camera. Yeah, I just.
If only he were.
Oh. That I'd recreate some of that magic from this episode.
Well, there's Daleks in there, so that's a good start,
Yes,
isn't
exactly.
it?
You've got the Dalek behind you.
Just need to put the satellite dish on him.
And the big massive fender.
Yeah. So who wants to introduce this one then?
Well, James has the background, so I think he should do it.
Okay. So yes, it is forbidden to dump bodies in the river. It was going to be my other background. So we are on Earth, and the Daleks are back, and it's really weird watching this, and I'll be interested in your thoughts. Does your mind automatically take you to the Peter Cushing film and you start comparing it? I mean, I've watched this episode, this story many times. I've watched the film many times, and my brain, whenever I start watching this, is like, what happened in the Peter Cushing? What was this scene? What was that scene? But yeah, so the Daleks have invaded Earth. They use some meteorites to bring about a plague. All sounds rather familiar. So what year was this? 2023. Yeah. So they have taken over the planet, and the TARDIS crew find themselves trapped outside of the TARDIS in this post-apocalyptic Britain, with Daleks doing Nazi salutes outside every single monument and landmark, which is must be great fun for the publicity. As you were saying, the Daleks are, at this point, so popular. That's what the kids want to see, and they get to see them all, through all these different landmarks. And yeah, it's a bit of a slog though for me. It just feels like this story goes on a long time.
And is that because you're comparing it to the film?
I don't, and this is the thing, is I find it quite difficult to separate the two. But the episodes feel quite ploddy compared to the film. But obviously we're comparing two different things, so it's quite difficult to do that. But the TARDIS crew gets separated, and we'll talk about some of the characters as we go through, I'm sure, but they all get sort of separated off, that they all end up sort of meandering their way to Bedfordshire to for the final sort of confrontation. There's alligators, there's Slither, there's the old woman in the house. There's all these sort of little bits and pieces that happen along the way. Susan falls in love, and it's interesting because she sees the true horror of war as well. So there's a few scenes where she sort of sees things happening, and whether that influences what happens later on in the story, I don't know, but certainly there's a bit of a character shift with her. But yeah, it's a very well-known Dalek story because it's been done on the TV, it's been done on the movies as well.
But it's a story that's obviously very iconic, isn't it? So, Daleks in London. And at the time, that probably was quite a shock to the audience that, they've taken the Daleks from a million years in the future, or whatever they were when we first met them in the Dead Planet, or whatever you want to call it. And here they are invading Earth 2164, something like that. It's not 2150 AD, which is what I always imagine it was, but it isn't. And you've got them right in the middle of London, see deserted London, beaten up London, and irrespective of what they're doing in Bedfordshire, we'll get to that in a minute, that's going to have resonated with a lot of the young viewers at the time. And this is really now at the peak of Dalek mania, isn't it? Let's be honest, the Daleks are now everywhere. And this is probably the story that launches them into something much, much bigger than they were even after their first appearance, roughly about a year earlier.
And the interesting thing is, I sort of approached this season on a watch back, very mindful of its original broadcasting. To quantify, when I was a kid, I used to have like the Dalek Invasion was 2 VHSs, wasn't it? So you got to the end of the first VHS, and you put the next VHS, and it'd be like, oh, there's another. It's a lot to get. Web Planet was the same, and I didn't do them in full chunks. I actually some of these sort of Romans, could do straight through as full, but I did this story and Web Planet, I guess, did them in chunks. I did them in 2s or 3s. I didn't do it the whole thing in one sitting. So I think that's basically a very deadly way of coming at this. And I think watching them in little bits, I didn't feel the drag as much, because it was a bit like, oh, I'll watch some more of that now. And that's, I think, because we have discussed this,
Yeah.
I'm not being patronising, but they are weekly installments. So in some ways, if I'm going back to being the 10-year-old kid in 1964, every week it's more Daleks and it's a bit more story. It's more Daleks, a bit more story. But it does go on a journey. I mean, yes, the movie does it in 84 minutes. You can't get around that. But it's such a different way of telling this. I like this is a lot darker, I think, than the movie. The movie's very much neon color and popcorn, and that's great for what that is. This is it's quite dark. There's a lot of sort of, there are bits like where they go back to the resistance place, and there are people just wailing and moaning because the head, the minds are broken because everything's quite doom laden, and they make quite clear that they firebomb London, don't they? That like London's gone, and it's quite dark. I just think, and a lot of the feel of it's quite oppressive, and it feels like it's the end of days, and and I think because Jenny's character in it is so pessimistic and so unpleasant, you sort of wait for Barbara to say to her, just shut up, love, we've got to get on with it. But it's great because that character would be like that because they've experienced it. So when Doctor Who and his plucky gang turn up and say, let's fight the Daleks, you'd be like, what do you think we've been doing? It hasn't worked. Life is naff and we're all going to die. And that's quite a sort of dark feel, I think, that goes through this.
It's the whole thing with Dortmund and his bombs as well. He keeps developing these explosives, and they ultimately don't work, and he ends up sacrificing himself so that I think it's Barbara and Jenny can escape, knowing that the bombs may not work, and that his whole character is driven to develop this explosive to sort of strike back at the Daleks, and it just looks so pitiful when he sort of goes out in his wheelchair and throws the bomb, which pretty much doesn't have any impact whatsoever and just gets exterminated. And the characters that they meet along the way are all in it for themselves as well. So the old lady and at the house who quite gladly turns them over to the Daleks. When Ian gets to that sort of camp, and and again it's like they're all in it. They're all trying to survive this nightmarish world. So yeah, it is. There's a scene where Susan is listening to machine gun fire or Daleks exterminating people. You don't actually see it, but you hear it, and there is that feeling of oppression and death. In many of those scenes.
And actually, when you think about the broadcast date for this, because obviously you're going to take us right back there. You're only what 20 years after the end of World War II. So this is something that some of the parents watching along with the kids are also going to be picking up on some of this sort of darkness, some of this despair that's going on in the story.
There's the horrible with the Robo Man and his brother. I mean, they it's a children's afternoon serial, and they sort of kill each other, don't they? His brother and the Robo, and he's sort of saying, "Remember your wife," and I mean, it's fairly dark. I mean, none of that sort of yeah, I think it's brave, and I do think as we're coming through this, I sort of drew the analogy. I know this is the end of block 1, so it's not quite this, season, but series 2 and season 2 have got a very similar vibe in that they've got the confidence of what's gone before to know what's worked and expand on it. And I think it would have been very easy for Doctor Who to have come back and done something, just retrod, just kept going. But every story, I think, as we come along this run, is trying something new. It's trying something different. It's broadening the adventure, not repeating the adventure. And I think that's quite remarkable. And I applaud that. And I don't think I'd quite appreciated that as much as going through them in order like this, where you go, oh, actually, no, this makes sense that you're doing this and you're trying this, and this is, really working. It's our last adventure with Susan, though. So how do we think Susan fares, and are we sad to see her go?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's the changing of the guard here, isn't it? And this has not been done previously. This was the first time one of the regulars has decided to step away from the series or leave, as the story would tell us. For me, it's a bit of an odd one, because I think Susan leaving, I'm perfectly happy to accept that she's left leaving the program, and write the character out by all means. But this feels terribly awkward and tacked on, and I don't think is a particularly fitting ending for her in the series.
I disagree. I quite like the build with the relationship with her and David, and the Doctor noticing it, and there's quite some subtle moments there where TV's Doctor Who notices that there's something going on there, but doesn't acknowledge it overtly, and then David also acknowledges that Doctor Who's got a place in the hierarchy, and sort of bows. There's lots of lovely little bits, I think, especially sort of episode 4 or 5 when they've got the campfire and all that sort of stuff. I think the build's there.
It's quite brutal that he just goes, he locks the door, doesn't he? He double locks the door and just says, no, you're staying here because you've grown attached to him. Which is, it's quite, is it tough love, or is it just, I'm sick of the sight of you? I don't know, but it's kind of like you've met someone. You're right. He sees the relationship a couple of times. He spots it and questions it, and so he decides to do it for her. And just sort of like say no. You get that speech, which obviously you get in the Five Doctors. Is repeated, but you get that speech at the end where he's talking directly to her and just says, basically, go live your life. I'm going to leave you on a planet that's been decimated by the Daleks, but go live your life. You found someone to be with.
I mean, that is one of Hartnell's definitive scenes for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose the problem falls, and it's a problem that has fallen with Susan from story 1 onwards, is realistically, if you look at it in the broader scope of things, Susan's a Time Lord. So while she appears to be a 16-year-old girl or whatever, she's presumably, like Romana, a couple of 100 years old or something. Mm. But within the storyline of him saying, you're now a young woman, that would then suggest that she's about 18 or something. So it's almost like there's that feeling within it that they're not quite, I mean, they haven't obviously settled within the continuity that was to come later, because they couldn't have settled that. But you know what I mean? There is a notion that she might be alien, but she is still meant to be a teenage girl. But obviously what comes later suggests that she's not a teenage girl, because if she's like Doctor Who, then she wouldn't be. So if you were leaving her behind to become a married woman, you'd know that she'd lived that for 30 years or 40 years or whatever, and then she'd still be the same age looking, and then she'd regenerate or something.
And I think that's probably why I'm finding the continuity a little bit awkward then, where they're not quite settled in it, because I think there's a line in episode 1 where Hartnell turns to her and goes, I'll give you a jolly good smack bottom. And that, he's almost speaking down to a child almost at that point in episode 1, but by episode 6, he's double locking the doors, and she's not allowed back on because she's fallen in love with somebody she met a couple of days earlier. He's pushing her out onto a new life that she doesn't know that she wants to do. And that's why I think it's awkward and jars a little bit for me, because I think you've taken quite a big character step through this story that hadn't actually been looked at in any previous story up until now. So there's where I find the awkwardness of it, probably.
I think the problem is, and we discussed this, dear viewer, on our season 1 review, is they never really knew what to do with Susan. Susan sort of goes from being stroppy teenager to weird alien girl and then back. And I do like her swift character change in this, though. I do. There are elements in this story where you can see her maturing, and you can see her learning from David and what's happening around her. Yet it is, and there are, after this one, it kind of set the precedent for, if someone's going to be written out, shall we get them married before, meet someone within 4 episodes, fall madly in love, and then they're leaving. But I guess it was always going to be an interesting one to try and write her out, and I'm glad that she got that ending. She met someone, she developed a bit, and then she fell in love. It's a little bit, for me, it's a bit cruel what the Doctor does, but then I think she would have just said, bye, I'm going with my grandfather, he needs me to look after him, and he doesn't. That relationship is not that way round. He's quite happy, and there's some interesting scenes that come up in next couple of stories where he's, for an old man, he's quite spry. He gets into quite a few fights, and he doesn't need looking after. He can look after himself, and he's doing it for her best interest, and just saying, look, stay, go. And
the key line in the door lock, I don't think it's a harsh thing. David says he knew you could never leave him. It's that thing of, if he hadn't made the move, seeing what you want, he knows that you'd have been held back by, So I that's quite. I mean, for a kids show, that's quite a deep sort of thought on relationships and things. So no, and this episode is one of the longest, isn't it? It overruns by a couple of minutes past its regular slot. But it feels like it has that moment to breathe, because she walks away and the keys on the floor, and it's the song, music in it, the chagrin music is great. Love that all the way through, and that really adds to the feel of this. But I do think that that's a nice end for Susan, and it's a nice, it feels like the end of that full stop, and then start things up again. I mean, if you want to, dear viewer, you can pick it up in Whatever Happened to Susan Foreman with Jane Asher, which is quite the listen if you ever hear that. Have either of you ever listened to that?
No.
I must say that one has slipped me by. I don't know how that's happened.
That is, I think it might be an extra on the I don't know. Anyway, it is a very unusual listen, and an unusual take on that. Susan, played by Jane Asher, suggests the Doctor who's left her behind because he wants to hook up with lots of pretty young girls. So, anyway, listen to it. It's unusual, but probably not one you'd want to put into the world of Doctor Who continuity.
You do. I mean, before she goes, she manages to twist her ankle, which we know is going to be something that she's going to continue doing. So, get that in first. But it's a strange one, isn't it? David Whittaker wrote the departure bit at the end for Susan. He wanted to do that. So yeah, and like you say, it does overrun. But it's bearing in mind that it's the first character to leave the series as well. It's quite a moment.
Because it's interesting, because I think there's some talk of Jenny being a character that would have been kept on as the
like her. That was the original plan, but then once they saw her, like you say, she's quite pessimistic. They just decided against taking her on.
I think her scenes with the balaclava would have been quite good. She'd taken her balaclava into the TARDIS and worn that in many other scenes going forward.
When we did the Doctor Who Talk Phantom commentary for this, Miss Davies did explain the balaclava. So have a listen, dear viewer. It's explained the balaclava as.
Yes, there is a good reason for it.
Mm.
But the amazing thing is actually just noticing that. Sorry, the London filming now. If you went to London at 6 o'clock in the morning now, it would still be so many people around. There'd be so much traffic. I don't think there'll be a point in the day where you could be like, let's get the cameras down to the South Bank and start filming this. You literally couldn't do it. I love that it's like Sunday morning, so there'll be no one around, and pretty much get away with it. I think there's one shot in there where the van goes by, deep in the background. But Daleks going over the bridge and all that stuff, you just couldn't do it. There wouldn't be any point this week where you say it's so quiet, just nip down there and start filming.
And again, it's an ambitious piece of filming, and Richard Martin is known for being quite the director anyway, and he was always keen to try new things, but to literally go out on almost like a guerrilla style filming regime and literally just wheel Daleks around London for a few hours on a Sunday morning and do a couple of van chases and various bits. It was quite ambitious. Again, I think it's about that whole thing of them trying different things and new things, which what you've already said, P-Bal.
But I think the word iconic is something that gets bandied about an awful lot. But there are a lot of iconic moments in this. The Dalek coming out of the Thames, the Daleks going over the bridge and around all the different locations. Even that. I even know that little shaky Dalek saucer that goes by. It does. There are just lots of iconic things in this, and it is sort of Doctor Who's first blockbuster, isn't it? There's a real feel that this is a big one.
Yeah,
and I can't bring myself to change the setting so that I have the CGI saucer and the van painted out, and I've got to watch it in its traditional sense because that's how it was meant to be seen. And you're right that the iconic is an overused word, but in this instance it's not, because there are so many strong visuals that come out of this program. As I said earlier on, James, you've got the Daleks and they're doing Nazi salutes as they're going past the sort of monuments, and you've got Daleks on the bridge. I mean, that shot alone of those Daleks going across Westminster Bridge is probably one of the most recognizable scenes, I would say, in Doctor Who over the years.
And the Daleks themselves, I love all the scenes with on their little saucer and stuff like that, the black Dalek and all that. They're sort of the epitome of that kind of Dalek mania vibe, isn't it? I mean, even before I saw it, there's that lovely photo, isn't there, of Jenny with the neck thing held against the wall. And it looks so 60s sci-fi, doesn't it? Just there's just an absolute look to all this that's incredible. The other thing I really like as well is that Barbara continues to be that sort of unsung hero, doesn't she, of many of these stories, and her ingenuity at the end of using her historical knowledge as a teacher to get onto the Dalek command. It's a lovely piece, and it's nice that that's something that's carried through a lot of the stories, I think. Yeah,
she's definitely developed into a really strong character that's able to hold her own, and it's quite an ingenious way of, she's quite fearless in some stories where she stands up against whoever it is that is threatening them.
And the external filming aside, even the work in the studio, because they were for the first time filming from Riverside Studio 1, which is quite a big studio. So therefore you've got the Sloane Square set with the saucer down, and they're able to bring the ramp down and wheel Daleks onto the floor, and that's all one big set as well. So inside the spaceship, they would just hoist the cameras up onto a different level and they would shoot from within the actual set itself. It's just been, that's the sense of scale I think this story has got. There's a couple of flaws in it, but there is a sense of ambition and scale in this that I think, again, is something we're going to see in Doctor Who over and over again, but this certainly is a step on from the first time we saw the Daleks, for sure.
And with the ramp, you have to be careful you don't drop Mr. Hartnell.
I was going to say that's what happened. He ended up injuring himself because he tripped over a camera stand, and so then he had to have a week off because he was temporarily paralysed. He really hurt himself, so they had to get a stand-in to do the shots of him from the back, so where you didn't see his face.
The very first appearance of Edmund Warwick.
Yeah. Yes, it was quite sort of nasty accident, but he recovered quite quickly and said, "Look, I want to get back to filming." From a Dalek point of view, when they came to shoot this, they only had 2 of the original Daleks left. So 2 of the first lot of Daleks they'd given to St. Bernardo's, the children's charity. They'd given 2 Daleks to them, so they had to go back and ask them and say, "Can we have our Daleks back because we're filming?" And then they created 2 new ones, so they had 6 by this point.
It's the only time though we see them with the saucer, the sort of sky dish on the back of them, and the really big sort of piece at the bottom, the skirt. That's right. And for me, they just seemed a little bit. I'm a traditionalist with my Dalek designs. You know, that's the design. They don't need a big skirt, and they don't need a big satellite dish on the back of them. I understand why they were done that way. They were an addition for this particular story because of the fact that they established them as only being able to go around on static electricity previously. But it just these are not my favorite Dalek design, I have to say.
The skirts were for the location, weren't they? Just so they could move them about, out and about, rather than just studio, I think. Yeah. I mean, our big shout out here has to go to Mr. Dalek and Slither extraordinaire Nicholas Evans. So that's our big shout out here. Lovely chap. So there we go. Slither's another one of those amazing things, isn't it? Because the Daleks never bring that back, do they? They've just got that there for the Bedfordshire experiment, haven't they?
I don't know if it's ever established. There's only the one, isn't there? There isn't a family of Slithers there or anything, is there?
Well, hopefully we can get them back in the new series.
There was supposed to be mutated humans originally, but then they changed that. So there's the whole thing about alligators in the sewers as well that have escaped from all the different zoos. But the idea was that there was mutations of humans that were living in the sewers.
And
I love that zoo thing, though, don't you? That notion that obviously when an invasion takes place or whatever, there are repercussions that you wouldn't necessarily think of. Of course, a zoo would be like that. You would be abandoned or it'd be blown open, and the creatures would get out, and it would be, I like it. It's quite a throwaway thing, but it's a nice part. The thing that's sort of design-wise, I do love the big skirt satellite dish Daleks. Robo-Man. Now, again, James mentioned this earlier about comparing movie and TV version. I know when I was watching Dexter came in and he said it's a bit, when you compare it to the movie version, they're all quite slick and amazing looking. Sort of. The Robo-Men, they're a bit clunky. They've got the basis sort of the 10th Planet Cybermen, haven't they? They're on the way there, but that's some serious clunk.
And they break very easily. Whenever the actor just even goes to fall over, they fall apart. They're not even very well made.
No, it feels like it should just be something a little bit more subtle. That's just it feels like the Dalek tech is a bit basic, and they've put a giant hairdryer on them. I mean, the funny thing about that is, what you said about the bits falling off, is that bit, the scene in the sewer where TV's Doctor Who comes out and gives him a good old battering with a cane. He's a violent old bugger, isn't he? He loves that.
He is. He's quite surprisingly spry and quite vicious.
Then he says he enjoys it, doesn't he? He's like, oh, I love a bit of physical. I know that's right. Rosie has this fight, but he does love a scrap, doesn't he?
Yeah.
It's not the pacifist we were led to believe.
No, not at all. A couple of other facts. It's the first time that you hear about the Dalek hierarchy, because you've got the Black Dalek in this one, and they talk about the Supreme, I think it is. They talk about the different casts of Daleks. The vetoed, that was an in joke because there were several set designs that were described as too ambitious, and they basically told them that they were vetoed. So they put vetoed all over the set. And then sadly, Jean Conroy, who played the old lady, she died before.
The young lady.
The young lady. She died in an accident before it was broadcast. So yeah, sad but true.
It should be noted that the Daleks are mining in Bedfordshire because they know that one day there'll be an amazing convention called Utopia that they can go to in July. Was that subtle?
Getting in early.
They just knew. I'd imagine that they're sort of drilling somewhere around Why Boston resorts, somewhere like that.
Mm.
On the website.
Yeah. I would agree. It's definitely there. It's a good excuse to go to Bedfordshire, wouldn't you agree?
Bring your own magnetic core.
Yeah.
Oh, the
You're
whole
exactly
magnetic. Can I just say that the whole magnetic core of the planet bit, it is a little bit silly, isn't it?
It's a strange divert on, and you can almost just think, okay, fine, that they've invaded the planet and they've taken it over. They've enslaved people. They've transformed people. They've taken mineral. The fact that they're then like, do you know what we're going to do now? We're going to hull this baby and we're going to drive it around space. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's nice. It's fine. Do you know what? I've had worse ideas.
Mm.
This is one of them.
And it doesn't detract that badly from the story either, from my opinion.
No, and you do have the slightly, bless it. It's a very basic model where the little bomb comes down at the end. But what we say, I mean, Spencer Chapman, not long ago, passed away. Amazing design work on this, and I sort of keep reminding myself when I'm doing these is that the scope of what they're trying to achieve on the money that they were given and the limits is amazing, and I think to do something this epic is incredible.
And again, it goes back to what I said a little bit earlier in this chat. Is around that. I think for me, the standout set's the Sloane Square saucer set, and you've got all the sort of houses around the outside. Okay, you look closely at it, it's a little bit, obviously you can tell it's a studio, but that whole Dalek ship was a number of sets on different levels. And I think given that it's it's a weekly produced series, and that was having to be designed and put up in a new studio, I think they did some tremendous work, and full marks to Spencer Chapman's input on this story in particular.
Although David deactivating the bomb, that just came to me as quite a funny moment where he just throws a bit of acid and sort of yanks the clock out. That's a very dangerous way of deactivating a bomb that's meant to incinerate the area.
Mm.
It's fine. We forgive it. It's a weekly adventure series in 25-minute parts. It's fine. So do we have any scores then on Doctor Who and the Dalek invasion of Earth? Yes,
I'll make a start on this one. So for me, one of the standout stories, I think, for season 2, I think, obviously we've talked about the iconic nature of this with all the various visual cues that we've come to know and love over the years, but it's a good old-fashioned Dalek story, and Daleks invading Earth was always going to be a good ticket for any Doctor Who program back in the 60s. I think the Daleks are well used here. We'll come on to a story probably a little further on where we'll maybe question if they were as well used or not, but they were well used in this one. The story's good. So we say goodbye to Susan, and that gives us an opportunity to have a new companion at some point in the future. But for now, it's a great story. It's a good solid 8 for me.
Solid. I'm glad. I thought 7s were solid. Are you mixing them round again?
Well, I just wanted to say I'm fairly square on an 8, so it's solid enough for me on this one, so I'm sticking with it.
It's a square 8.
A square 8? Ooh, that could be a new phrase, actually.
Hi, James. Where are you? How square are you on this?
Not quite as square as that. Yeah, there's a lot I do like about this story, and like you said, there's lots of iconic moments, and maybe I am being a bit harsh because I do compare it to the film, and I love the film as well. There are some elements that just drag a little, and I know we've talked about it's episodic, and if I was watching it as it was broadcast, it probably wouldn't feel like that. But watching it, I did watch this in a block, so I watched the whole lot in one go, and I was kind of like, oh my god, I could get to Bedfordshire quicker than this at one point. So yes, lots of nice things about this. Obviously Susan leaving, that's not the nice thing, but obviously Susan leaves in this story. So it's like, I'm like, yeah, hooray, we got rid of Susan. But I scored this 7.5.
You weren't that far behind me.
Yeah, no, I was expecting to say like a 5 or something. When he's like, oh, I think I might have been a bit harsh with this.
No, there are Dalek stories that I much prefer, even though this is, in many ways iconic. There are other Dalek stories that I much prefer. But there we go.
I'm slightly worried here because this is the second season running where this has sort of started to occur. Because I scored this an 8.
Ooh.
I don't like to think that we've reached the point in our relationship now where we're all pretty much in agreement with the sort of scores we're giving these things.
I'm sure there's going to be a few stories coming up that's not going to happen.
We're all fairly at level. Well, anyway, that gives Doctor Who and the Dalek Invasion a 23.5.
That's an early strong contender for the season prize there.
But there are still another 400 serials in this run.
There is.
I know.
So at home, don't forget to like, to subscribe, to share this amongst the people.
Share us.
Join us. You must be like, anyway, okay. Like, subscribe, share, do all that stuff. Write things below that are nice, positive, uplifting. We even read them. We do read them. I get to start crying sometimes when I've read them. Okay, so thank you very much to...
it's James.
Yes, and thanks. Good always, as always, to be here with you, P-Bal.
You put his name in then. You didn't know his name.
He forgot his name.
It's like...
I thought that was a smooth link. No, I thought that was okay.
It's fine.
I'm doing all right.
Right, so join us again for part 2 of 4. We'll see you soon.